Welcome back to MCB 170, Society and the Brain. This is lecture 22, which corresponds to part 2 of module 11. The title of module 11 is God and the Brain. In module 11, we are discussing the neurobiological, psychological, and sociological aspects of religion. Since the Enlightenment, which was a philosophical movement in the 16 and 1700s, Western academics and thinkers have considered religion to be nonsense. They think religious beliefs are illogical. And they think that anybody who sat down and thought about religious beliefs logically, through reason, would reject them. On that view, the hypothesis would be that religious thoughts would be accompanied by activity in emotional parts of the brain, like the limbic system, rather than parts of the brain that mediate higher cognitive functions and reason, such as prefrontal cortex. In modern times, we've been able to test hypotheses like that. And what have we found? Recent studies on religious experiences induced by repetitive recital of religious texts or meditation suggest that attentional and higher cognitive functions associated with prefrontal cortex are more likely to underlie religious experience than emotional processes associated with the temporal limbic system. This was shown in a series of studies that began with this experiment by Azari and co-workers. This is a seminal article in that it was the first in a series of articles that made an important observation. The article by Azari and co-workers is your reading for the week. I'd like to go through it in some detail. Azari and co-workers found that during religious recitation of prayers and scriptures, self-identified religious subjects activated a frontal parietal circuit composed of the dorsolateral prefrontal, dorsomedial frontal, and medial parietal cortex. Prior studies indicate that these areas play a profound role in sustaining evaluation of thought. Thus, they concluded, religious experience may be a cognitive process, which nevertheless feels immediate. In other words, religious thoughts are cognitive processes, associated with emotions, yes, but they're predominantly cognitive processes. Here are the brain regions activated in the experiment by Azari et al. They include the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, right there. Dorsomedial frontal cortex, right medial parietal cortex, and cerebellum. Limbic areas were not activated. Here's how they interpreted their results. Prefrontal cortex holds knowledge representations, which manage memories and mediates conscious thoughts. Medial parietal area is otherwise known as the precuneus. We haven't spoken about it, but it comes up often in studies of social cognition. It plays a role in visual memory and has strong connections with prefrontal cortex. The dorsomedial frontal area is the pre-supplementary motor area, that is, it's higher order motor cortex and primary motor cortex. It's where we find our mirror neurons, which we've spoken about a lot in the past. It receives input from prefrontal cortex. And the cerebellum. The cerebellum was also active in this study. It mediates motor control and cognitive processes. And together, dorsomedial frontal cortex and cerebellum mediate readiness for action. This is pretty fascinating. The second two say that religious thoughts ready the nervous system for action. This is reminiscent of the thinking of Douglas Steere, the theologian Douglas Steere, that we discussed in the previous module, who said that prayer is incipient action. Prayer readies the person who is praying to act in the world according to the values that they're praying about. The first two are even more interesting. They say that religious thoughts involve knowledge, memory, and conscious thought, cognitive processes, including reason. To summarize, Azari identified a circuit which is composed of the prefrontal, dorsomedial frontal, medial parietal cortices at the cerebellum. Activation of this circuit seems to underlie subjective religious experience and may also ready the individual for action. These results, these brain scan results, paint a very different picture than the one you would have painted based on Enlightenment thinking. I'd now like to go through a series of similar experiments using brain scans to analyze the brain activity patterns of individuals who are experiencing religious thought of one kind or another. Here's a study by Andrew Newberg, who we met in part one, who was a noted researcher on brain activity associated with religious thinking. He measured brain activity using single photon emission computed tomography, which is, without going into detail, a much more accurate way of measuring brain activity than fMRI. And he did this study on Franciscan nuns while they were praying, and their prayer involved internal repetition of a particular phrase, a spiritual sacred phrase to them. He found increased activity in prefrontal cortex, also in the inferior frontal lobes and the inferior parietal lobule. He found decreased activity in the superior parietal lobule, which was thought to be associated with altered state of body schema. That's sort of a fancy way of saying that the nuns, while they recited sacred scripture, maybe experienced some loss of ego, some disconnection from time and space. However, these spiritual feelings were associated with activity in prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason. In another study by Beauregard and Paquette, Carmelite nuns were analyzed while they were subjectively in a state of union with God. In this case, they actively recalled such a state. This distinction is pretty important because these Carmelite nuns were not willing to enter into an actual state of communion with God while they were in a scanner, kind of at the command of experimenters to summon God. They refused to do that. What they agreed to do was to remember, while they were in the scanner, a time when they were feeling in the presence of God. So they probably weren't entirely happy about this situation. They agreed to do it anyway. While they were in this state, they activated regions that were distributed over the entire brain. Let's see what they found. Here's brain activity in Carmelite nuns during a mystical experience. Well, it wasn't really during a mystical experience. It was really while they were recalling such an experience. Activation was observed in the following regions: medial, orbital frontal, and prefrontal cortex. Also medial temporal cortex, inferior and superior parietal lobules, insula, anterior cingulate cortex, caudate, and brainstem. Wow. Distributed for sure from the highest levels of the brain, orbital frontal and prefrontal cortex, to the lowest, the brainstem. How did Beauregard and Paquette interpret these interesting findings? Well, they did so with a certain amount of poetic license, I would say. They said temporal cortex is active because it was mediating subjective impressions of contacting spiritual reality. That's pretty subjective. Caudate nucleus was active to signal positive emotions such as happiness, romantic love, and maternal love. That's possible. We found activity of the caudate nucleus in studies where people were behaving kindly toward each other. How about this one? Insula. Autonomic regulation, integration of external sensory experience, and visceral state. What do they mean by that? We know that insula activity is associated with disgust. How about anterior cingulate cortex? Interoceptive detection of emotional signals during mystical state and visceral regulation. I don't know about that either. We know anterior cingulate cortex activity is associated with conflict. Why would these Carmelite nuns, when thinking thoughts of God, or at least remembering a time when they felt close to God, why would insula and anterior cingulate be activated? Probably because they really weren't entirely happy about doing it. They felt that it was somehow maybe degrading their faith. They could conceivably have experienced some amount of conflict and disgust at the situation. But despite all of that, there was also activity in the prefrontal cortex, which Beauregard and Paquette say was due to conscious awareness of feelings of union, metacognitive representation of emotional state. Well, we know the prefrontal cortex activity is associated with reason. So yet again, the higher cognitive faculties, including reason, as manifested in activity of the prefrontal cortex, was observed while these nuns thought about their religion. Here's in another study, which was done in Europe involving Danish Christians. The subjects engaged in different forms of mental activity that were related to praying, whether making wishes to Santa Claus, reciting a nursery rhyme, engaging in personal prayer, free-form prayer, not memorized prayer, a condition where people are trying to talk directly to God, or reciting the Lord's Prayer, otherwise known as the Our Father, which is in the Christian tradition. And they saw increased activity in these regions, the precuneus, which we mentioned before, it's part of the parietal lobe, the temporal parietal junction and the temporopolar region, which are involved in theory of mind, self and other relationships, and medial prefrontal cortex, involved in reasoning. Here's their data in graphical form. A, B, C through D are the different brain regions, precuneus, temporal parietal junction, temporopolar region, and C here is the prefrontal cortex. The columns are wishes to Santa Claus, the nursery rhyme, the personal prayer, free-form prayer, and the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father. And you can see that in all four of these brain regions, all of these different mental activities increase their activity. And this was especially true for the prefrontal cortex when engaged in prayer, in spiritually meaningful thought, whether reciting the Lord's Prayer, and especially during free-form prayer where the subject was communicating with God in their mind. They thought they were. They felt they were. That's what they were doing. And yet another study. They measured not only brain activity using fMRI, but also analgesia, tolerance to pain. Subjects saw either a religious or non-religious image before and during shock, after which they rated the intensity of the pain experienced and the degree to which they felt affected by the image. So here we see a nice painting of a woman in biblical times. And this painting depicts Mary, mother of Jesus of Nazareth. So the images were shown to the subject, and they could be affected by it. Then they experienced shock, electric shock. They then reported the intensity of the shock and how much they were affected by the image. And what did they find? They found that religious images could produce analgesia in Catholics, but not in non-religious people. So contemplating and being affected by a religious image that had religious meaning for the Catholics reduced the pain they experienced when they were shocked. The analgesia was accompanied by Activity in the prefrontal cortex in the Catholics, not in the non-religious people. The prefrontal activity may be related to deliberate control of pain perception, a conscious controlled process, a controlled process controlling an automatic process. Activity in brainstem was observed in both subject groups and was correlated with the degree to which the subjects were affected by the image, whether religious or non-religious. Here's their data in graphical form. The gray bars show the non-religious condition. The black bars show the religious condition. In the non-religious group or the religious group, non-religious group, religious group. In A, we see pain intensity. Pain intensity was the same for the non-religious folks, whether the image was non-religious or religious. Pain intensity was a lot lower for the religious folks when the image was religious. So when the Catholics saw a picture of Mary, who they believe was the mother of Jesus of Nazareth, their pain response was lowered. This shows how affected they were by the image. The non-religious subjects were not affected by either image. The religious subjects were much more affected by the religious than by the non-religious image. So the religious people felt something which involved their prefrontal cortex when they saw an image of Mary, mother of Jesus. And that decreased the pain they felt when they were shocked. Here are brain scans from the Weiss experiment showing activity in prefrontal cortex and brainstem, the highest level and the lowest level of the brain when individuals beheld religiously significant images. Here's the last study I'd like to consider in this series by Harris et al., where subjects pondered the truth or falsity of statements. And what they found was that Christians and non-Christians have different beliefs, but they process the truth or falsity of statements, whether religious statements or statements of ordinary facts, using the same brain areas, specifically the prefrontal cortex and the lateral occipital gyrus and the superior frontal gyrus. So here you see these three different places. Here's prefrontal cortex here, lateral occipital gyrus and superior frontal gyrus. I call your attention to the prefrontal cortex. Interestingly, when these individuals pondered the truth or falsity of certain statements, whether religious or non-religious, there was decreased activity in prefrontal cortex. The true statements are shown in blue, the false statements are shown in red, different shades. The Christians are the deeper shades. You can see that basically whether they're pondering true statements or false statements, the activity in the brains of Christians and non-Christians is the same, not distinguishable statistically. So here you have religious people or non-religious people contemplating the truth or falsehood, evaluating the truthfulness or the falseness of religious statements or non-religious statements, and the brain activity patterns are the same. All of these studies suggest that religious thoughts are like other thoughts. When we evaluate religious ideas, religious beliefs, we're using the same parts of the brain that we use when we're evaluating other kinds of thoughts or beliefs. It says that religion is not an accident of cognition. It's like other forms of cognition. It's really not different from other forms of cognition. When we think about religion, when we think about God, whoever we conceive God to be, we're using our prefrontal cortex. We're using the same parts of the brain that we use when we think about other things. Thinking about religion is a normal part of cognition. This brings us back to the thought of Pascal Boyer, who is the leading anthropologist on religion. He said that people do not generally have religious beliefs because they have pondered the evidence for or against the actual existence of particular supernatural agents. Boyer really stressed this idea of supernatural agents. He kind of thinks that all religions involve belief in supernatural agents. That isn't necessarily true, but he emphasized that aspect of religion. Rather, he said, they grow into finding a culturally acquired description of such agents intuitively plausible, intuitively. So he's basically reflecting the Enlightenment view that's been dominant in Western thought since the 1600s, that religion is nonsense, that it's not logical, that anybody who thought about it would reject it, and that it must be emotional. You can't accept it through reason. You can only accept it through emotion. People convince you that it's true, and they convince you to feel that it's true. This thinking goes back to the Enlightenment period, the 1600s and 1700s, in Europe and in England. And it all begins with the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was scathing in his criticism of religion. He dismissed all religion as credulity, otherwise known as baloney, ignorance and lies. He said that the gods exist only in the minds of believers, that the gods are creatures of their own fancy. And he said that humans create gods, or they create the concept of God, and then they stand in awe of their own imagination. So Hobbes really began the tradition in Western thought of rejecting religion on the grounds that it's illogical. It does not stand up to reason. It's unreasonable. So Hobbes, Auguste Comte, other Enlightenment philosophers thought that religion is primitive. Karl Marx, the philosopher who brought socialism theory, saw religion as a tool of exploitation, as the opium of the masses. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, saw religion as psychopathology. And many university faculty today basically think that religion is for idiots, that smart, thoughtful people are not religious. Is that true? Well, here's an interesting study that was done back in the 50s, where sociologists interviewed faculty, university faculty in different disciplines, and asked if they were religious, if they attend religious services, or if they oppose religion. And mathematicians, it turns out, were the most likely to be religious and to attend religious services. Next were physicists, then biologists, then faculty in the social sciences, starting with economics and then down to anthropology. The anthropologists were the least religious. And the percentage of mathematicians who opposed religion were only about 10%, but the percentage of psychologists and anthropologists who oppose religion was about 20%. What these data pretty clearly say is that individuals who are arguably pretty smart, like mathematicians and physicists and other scientists, don't reject religion. And many of them even consider themselves religious. And many of them even go to religious services. This work was updated recently by Elaine Howard Eklund. During 2005 and 2006, the study of religion among academic scientists examined the religious and spiritual beliefs and practices of natural and social scientists at 21 of the most influential research universities in the United States. She actually called me. She called me on the phone out of the blue one day, and we had a very interesting discussion. And so did over 1,600 of my colleagues at research universities. And these studies revealed that college faculty are not as anti-religious as you might suppose. A surprising number of faculty who teach science are also part of the religious tradition. In fact, about half of them practice some religion or other. These scientists approach religion and spirituality in diverse ways, sometimes very different from the general public. But she found that the majority of scientists, over 65%, are interested in matters of spirituality. Why? Well, scientists are probably interested in spirituality for the same reason that other people are. And spirituality is a term that we're not defining. I'm not defining it. It's a hard term to define. But let me just say that spirituality, for many people, often serves as the basis for their moral values and ethical principles. It is said that there are no moral absolutes. How can you how can you prove that something is morally good or morally bad? Well, you can't really. A particular thought or action is only good or bad in the context of some belief system. And the belief systems of most people are often, well, belief systems of many people have a spiritual basis. Many people's belief systems have a religious basis. They get their basic belief system from a religion. So I think really the way to understand religion is not as an accident of normal cognitive processes, but as the very normal process of having to download moral values and ethical principles from culture into your controlled processes. As we have emphasized many times, brain processes, can be divided into controlled processes and automatic processes. Controlled processes involve deliberative thought, as mediated by the prefrontal cortex. Automatic processes involve emotion, as produced by the amygdala and other regions. Our automatic processes kind of come pre-programmed partly they learn through experience with the world on a kind of a statistical running average kind of basis. But our controlled processes do not come pre-programmed. We have to load moral values and ethical principles into our controlled processes from culture. So we download our values, the values by which we control our automatic processes, we download those values from culture. And an important part of culture is religion. Most anthropologists, including Pascal Boyer, acknowledge that religion is part of culture. In fact, they would say that culture and religion are not separable. You can't separate religion and culture. Religion is inextricably part of culture. Religion is an important part of most cultures. And a lot of cultures have as the basis of their moral values and ethical principles some religious tradition. And even people who aren't religious might still download from their culture religious ideas because those are the ones that are out there in culture. So my best guess is that religion is yet another form of a belief system that includes moral values and ethical principles that we need to download from culture in order to program our controlled processes. Rather than seeing religion as some mistake or accident of normal cognitive processes, we think about religion and download religious ideas and evaluate religious ideas and internalize religious ideas just the way we internalize other kinds of ideas using our normal cognitive processes. I'll end there.